Welcome to Power BI Manchester User Group for June. This is our part 2, as we had issues with Benni 2 weeks ago. So tonight we've got a one-off special with Benni Jagere. So welcome to everyone who has joined us, and welcome to everyone that's watching us online. So for everyone who's not attended a Power BI User Group session in person or virtually, we've been going for around about almost 4 years now. We've got over 2,500 members on Meetup. It's now 6,500 followers on LinkedIn, and when we do face-to-face user group sessions, we have around 60 to 80 attendees per month. Sometimes we've had over 100 for the likes of when we had Jagere Cube back in March of last year. We will be hoping to commence user group sessions as and when we're allowed to in person. That probably won't be until the back end of this year or early next year. As I said, we were a fun user group, and we are all about sharing and discovering Power BI and sharing best practice. So, as I said, we've had some great testimonials. We've got a 4.6 out of 5 Uber star rating for our sessions. So yeah, a bit about me. I'm a experienced BI data analytics recruiter with over 16 years experience. I've been running events for the last 7 years with Robert Walters, and I said, do get in touch if you are looking for a new role, or if you're looking to recruit, or you just have to market information. I'm happy to help you out. And I said, especially with what's going on with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemics we go on the world, we are able to help you with doing virtual onboarding and how to get the best out of hiring the right candidate in this market. So yeah, after my quick intro, we've just got Benni. He'll be doing an hour-long talk on troubleshooting Power BI report performance, and then we should wrap up with questions answered by around about 7:10. So do put your questions on the right-hand side. There is a Q&A tab, so put your questions through, and myself and Ben Howard's here tonight helping out. He'll try and answer them. If not, we'll push them through to Benni to answer when he wraps up around about 7 o'clock. About Benni, obviously he is a senior data insight consultant for Reelderman with a strong focus on the MI stack. Yeah, he said he turns a large amounts of coffee into insights for customers with reference to British comedy. So I think will be a really exciting talk tonight. And said he speaks at a lot of events around the world on Power BI conferences, and he's very, very highly recommended. So I was pleased to get him involved. And before we hand over to Benni, we are at Power BI Lunch and Learn Season 2 finale is next Wednesday. We've got Adriano De Silva from the States. He's got nice and early to talk about web scraping Power BI. So that's a session you don't want to miss. If you have missed out on some of the sessions featuring Lewis, Ben, Sheb, myself, and some of our guests this year, this summer, go to powerbisupport.co.uk and you can access all the videos on playback. That's Adriano Silva for our Season 2 finale next Wednesday. So without further ado, I'm now going to end my slides and pass you over to Benni over in Holland. Hello, Benni.
Hi.
How you doing? You okay?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. It was a long day today, but I'm actually very happy to be doing this right now. So I just gotta kill off the incoming video because apparently Teams is objecting. So this should be better. So thank you all for having me. Thank you, Alex, for the wonderful introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Benni Jagere. The pronunciation was quite okay. I've had very much worse pronunciations of my name. I'm calling into you from Belgium, actually.
I live
yeah. Sorry. Ben, can you? Sorry, it's Ben here. Yeah. We've still got Alex on the screen. I haven't managed to get you live yet. Can you share your content?
I am sharing my desktop right now.
Yeah, great. Let me throw that on there. Great. Now we've got, I think, your video and your desktop. My fault, my friend.
Yeah, no problem at all. So as I was saying, it's Belgium. It's a small country, but it is a big difference as opposed to the Netherlands. So I work as a senior data insights consultant. It is a very big and fancy term. It just means I do fancy stuff with data. I get large amounts of data and I do something for it with customers. What it is, it depends on what they want, what the budget they have, and what they actually need. But that's not the most important thing of all. Is if you do want to reach out to me after or during the session, my social details are on this slide, and you can just reach out to me and I'll do my utter best to get back to you as well. In life, I have one very important motto, and that motto is say no to pie charts. they're used all over the place, too much and too often, and I've seen some horrendous examples of them. So I just dislike seeing pie charts because they're usually abused in very wrong ways, and that's something that I like to see less of in the world. But I also co-run a user group called Data Mines. It's a bit the same thing as Power BI Manchester. The only difference is that we do other things than Power BI as well. We're tailored towards the entire Microsoft data and AI stack. So we're running virtual now as well. So if you have some spare time and you want to see some other sessions as well, other than the ones you're seeing here, because they are very high quality, just pop over to the website, find us, and maybe glance over. We'll welcome you with open arms. So about today is troubleshooting Power BI performance, Power BI report performance. What I want to teach you is, what I want to give to you is to just give you a set of options to start pinpointing common causes, because we've probably all experienced it, that the performance deteriorates in some ways, and it is hard to know where to get started with everything. There's so many options out there, and it is hard to get started. But techniques to solving them is one thing, but it is better to know how to avoid those things, because you do not have to put in the effort after to start fixing them again. So in the end, it boils down to a set of best practices that you can take home with you, or just have it somewhere lying around on the desk, whatever, to just look at and glance at, to keep in mind when you're designing those new reports, when you're designing those models. Because if you don't have to spend the time fixing those things, you can spend that time in doing other more fun stuff, like documentation or something. It is just keeping your mind open for learning new things, and generally you'll improve whatever you're doing. But I do want to stress, as a general reminder, because this is a confusion that I've had multiple times as well, is that this is not a DAX or Power Query performance deep dive. It is, first off, it's very difficult to do those in 60 minutes. And I want to stress the importance of this other key feature in Power BI. So I'll be touching briefly on DAX or Power Query, but my main emphasis will be on the model and the report performance itself. But why should we go ahead and troubleshoot report performance? Well, it is quite simple. None of us like to wait. I, for instance, don't like to wait as well. If I have to wait at the register at the supermarket and I have to wait for 5 minutes, then I get antsy and I want to do some different things. It is just generally time that you lose waiting. The same thing happens if you see a Power BI report and you have to wait for like a minute on those different kinds of spinny wheels. It is less than optimal. So reducing those wait times will generally end up having a better experience by those users. And that's in the end what we're striving for, because we can create and we can design reports all we want. If no one's using them, then, well, we generally didn't do enough of a good job. So improving those things will end up users having a better experience, which is very important. But also, this thing is, it works on my machine is the most terrible of answers that you can give. I admit I've done so in the past as well, but it is generally not a very good response, because there is a difference in machines you're using. If you're running on an older laptop, if you're running on a beast of a desktop machine, if you're running on one of those thin clients, whatever, they have some very big differences in them. And also in Power BI, this is definitely into effect. And I'll touch back on this a few times throughout the talk. It is definitely not a valid reply. But most importantly to keep in mind is that the context and the baseline are key. Let's say that we have a report. What is the size of the data? What is the complexity of the data we're working on? Is it an Excel file with 5,000 lines of sales data in it? Or is it a transactional till system from like Tesco or something that has probably about 500 million transactions each day or something, ballpark figure? I don't know. What's the volume and what's the complexity of data? Because if we're working on those very big data sets, then generally having the requirement that it needs to render in a second or less is very difficult to do so. But if it's 5,000 rows of Excel data, then we should be able to do so quite easily. But baseline as well is, what's the expectation of your end user? Are they expecting render times under 3 seconds? Are they expecting render time under the second? What's their expectation? Because if their expectations is, well, impossible, they have to be managed, those expectations. And it is the same thing with those expectations they have for anything related into troubleshooting, to performance in Power BI. But when I start, this is very important, I tend to go for quick wins on heavily used reports. So try to find out which are the reports that are used heavily and go for those little small tiny tweaks that you can do them instantly to get them some gains. Why am I mentioning this? Well, because my context, I'm a consultant, so I typically do smaller assignments at multiple customers. So every time I go into a new customer, I need to gain their trust. I need to be able to show my value to them instantly. And if I disappear into the basement for 10 days and do some dark magic with some ominous music, and I come back up there and I have 5% gain, well, they don't want to have me back. And the same thing is if you're working for a company and you're on the payroll or you're freelancing for that company, you still need to have that trust because they need to sign off on you investing the time in fixing those things. So that's why quick wins and then earn the trust and keep moving on, keep improving on those little things. So those long investigations on reports that are barely used is typically something I avoid to get started with, unless it's C-level management, because in general, they sign off on the budget and it's the budget that pays them to get me there. So it is weighing off what you need to do. But if I have to draw out a scientific formula for troubleshooting performance, it boils down to a mixture of science, art, and luck. It is knowing what to do and when. It is having that certain flair of just snapping that in there somewhere. And it is at sometimes just sheer dumb luck as well. You cannot know everything. That is simply impossible. A while back, I was in Dublin and I heard Bob Duffy coin the phrase the shotgun approach. And that means that he said for every 3 years of working with a product, you get a shotgun bullet and you get one for free. So that means if you're working for Power BI for 3 years, you get 2 shotgun bullets. And the shotgun bullet just means try something out, just whatever your gut feeling is. If that doesn't work, well, start working your way top down or bottom up. Just go through the chain and start working on those things. Because if you're jumping from here to there and just trying random things, either you get lucky, which boils down to the 20% luck, or you'll end up having to do this a very long time, which is less than ideal. But I'm a consultant, so my answer is, it depends. Sorry, there are so many unknown variables in there that it's really difficult to have the answer to everything. And you just have to look for some things, period. It is that way, period. But before I get started, there is something that I do need to explain to you, because there is this thing in Power BI called the noisy neighbors. And I used to have a picture here of a Manchester City football fan with noisy neighbors, but I decided that for this group, that may not be the best of ideas. So noisy neighbors, it means we're running on Power BI shared capacity. And Power BI shared capacity, if you're running on Pro, means that we're sharing with a bunch of other people the same resources. And theoretically, if everyone starts those heavy workloads at the same time, we can have some influence from that because we can get degraded performance. Is this going to be very noticeable? Well, probably not, because they have some very beefy machines handling all those things. But it is that way that we can never get the exact same results when we're benchmarking. So there is always some small point of fault tolerance that you need to keep into account. Hence, noisy neighbors. Is this noisy neighbors principle eliminated when you're using dedicated capacity? No, but then you'll have more control over what's happening because you are managing the capacity and you know what's happening on that at all times. But premium capacity is, well, shared resource, is a blessing and a curse. As I said, it is a very beefy machine and we won't have any of those. We won't have any of those issues most of the time, but we have to take what we can get from them. But it does manage everything for us, which is pretty handy because I've had some customers in the past and they rang me and they said, well, Benni, we're having issues with our performance in Power BI. Our CFO is now buying Power BI Premium P2, and that's going to solve all our problems. And then I told him, no, it's not. It's going to make him worse. So when do you want my appointment to come back to you guys to help you guys fix it? Well, no, it's going to fix everything. So we don't need you to come back for now. We got it. One day later, I got a phone call from the same client. Yeah, we need you here tomorrow because this isn't working. So they migrated to premium capacity. They dumped all their workloads on there, but they didn't think it through. You need to think about what you're doing there as well. But that is an entirely different topic, and I'm not going to go in there too much right now. Caching mechanisms are very, very real. What do I mean? Is that when you're doing something in Power BI, either it's Power BI desktop or you're in the service, when you're doing something, data is loaded, visuals are rendered, and it is saving small pieces of that inside of memory to be able to do the same operation the next time a lot quicker. So if you're rendering a big matrix that takes 15 seconds, you click on the next page and you come back, that same matrix will render a lot faster. That doesn't mean you fixed it, because that's just caching interfering with things. But caching, I will get back to as well. There's this report case that I have. It's a demo set that I'm using, and I'm using it for all my public reports and for most of my research data as well. So I come from Antwerp. I went to college there, and they have this thing called Villos, which is just it's municipal bikes you can share, and you can just pick one up at the station and drive to the next station and put it back in there. So I asked the Antwerp City Board, well, can I have the data, please? Because they're big on open data. And they said, no, you can't have it. You can only get the aggregates. And aggregates, they're not fun. I wanted to have the raw data. So I started looking for some other things, for for similar data sets. And then I found the same thing from New York. The New York data set is about 4 or 5 times as big as the Antwerp data set. They generally put everything on the internet. You can just download CSVs of usage data. You can get master data from it. It starts in June 2013, and it's going on for, well, until last month as well. There has been a drop in activity due to something going on throughout the entire world, but it's still generating that data. But that's the data set that I have, but that also means that I've got reports to show about this. And bear in mind, it is not a report that I've designed to look pretty or to be beautiful or to render quick. It is a report that's made intentionally to do some things wrong. But now you may be thinking, well, this is rendering super quick. Well, that is because the caching I just explained to you is at play here. I cheated and I rendered this one before showing it to you because I just quickly want to show the report, and that's it. After this, I'm just going to close it down again, and we're going to see the report again when it's in its full natural state of rendering. So remember now, I'm clicking and everything's going instantly. Everything's going quite smooth. So there's no real problem here. So I'll close this one down and keep going, because there is one thing that I do need you to be aware of before going into the report again. There is this thing inside of Power BI desktops. There are many things inside Power BI desktop. And what things might these be? Well, there are a bunch of processes running when you're booting up Power BI desktop, and you may not be aware of most of them, because I, for a fact, wasn't until I started researching this. And there is probably one that we're all aware of. It's this thing called Microsoft SQL Server Analysis Services. So it is the engine that is running analysis services and Power Pivot and all those things that is running in there. So it is just a virtual instance of analysis services that's booted up every single time we run a Power BI desktop file. Check. Okay, great. There's these things called the Microsoft Mashup Evaluation Containers. Well, what is this? It is Power Query files running. So most of these Power queries that we have, they also trigger a process, and they take up resources. So in Power BI Desktop, this is also where we can see a very big difference in performance, because, for instance, I made the initial version of this Power BI Desktop file on my beefy desktop, and then I forgot about it, imported it to my laptop, and then the laptop started hovering about an inch above the desk, and I thought I pretty much thought that I invented a hoverboard. But this thing is running locally inside of Power BI Desktop. As soon as we port it up to Power BI Service, dedicated or shared capacity, it's no longer our worry-ish. But then there are these other things called the CEF, so C# browser subprocesses. Well, what are these? And these are the particularly nasty ones, because these are the processes started up to render your visuals, to render the visuals you're using in the report. And these get booted back to the end user, because this is where it gets interesting. Because if we're using a visually heavy report, then the end user and the tools they're using, they're going to have a big influence on this. If they're using a 10-year-old laptop running Internet Explorer 7, then they're probably going to have a worse time than someone whooping out a brand new spanking Apple book, whatever they're using now, with these big graphical cards in it. There is going to be a big difference in there. So remember when I said works on my machine? This is where it gets interesting with that. But I will show you that later as well. And then there's this last thing called the console window host. This is just a console application that ties all these things together. It's orchestrating them. And that is a bunch of processes running inside of Power BI Desktop that we probably weren't aware of. I, for a fact, wasn't aware of these browser sub-processes. That's the one that I didn't realize, because I figured that analysis services was there, agreed. Power Query made sense. And then it's probably logical that there's something in there rendering the entire thing and orchestrating it. But the visuals, yeah, that was a bit tricky. I didn't realize that. But if I want to get started with the report, there's a bunch of tools that I typically want to use, because if I boot up the report, then if it's performing slow, well, I'm not just going to sit next to it with the notepad and start scribbling things down. You typically want to use tools to help you get there. And the first tool that is there is actually a tool that Microsoft released themselves. It's called Performance Analyser Pane. And it was introduced to the public in May 2019. And you can pretty much look at this as a flight recorder for all operations happening. So it records everything, every single click, every single mouse movement that we do when we're dragging something. It records every single visual that's rendered, every single thing that's happening in there, and it breaks it down for us. It breaks it down to a few of the execution times that we can use. And then also we can export those results with ease. We can export it to a JSON file and then send that JSON file up to someone else, and he can do, that person can do their magic with it. It is really useful, because before the Performance Analyser Pane was here, it was a bit more tricky, because we had to use some traces and some things with SQL Profiler to get the same results, which was not always that easy. But I will show you this as well, because I will go back to my report, and I'm landing here on the page so I can explain a few things, because this is a version of the report that's not been opened yet. It is just landing here. And why am I doing this is because I want to activate the Performance Analyser Pane before I go into the report, because otherwise I'll just see the same behavior that was happening just before, and I don't want that. I want the worst case behavior happening when I go ahead and troubleshoot. So I go ahead and I'll head up to the view pane, and then I can go ahead and select the Performance Analyser Pane. So if you're running the newer version of Power BI Desktop, this is the way it's looking right now. If you're running an older version, it is in the different layout, is still located under the view pane, under view tab. It's there. The ribbon looks a bit different, but it's the same thing. So go ahead and look at View and then Performance Analyzer. So click it open, and I'm going to free up some screen estate. And then you click this magical button called Start Recording, because what this will do, this will start the flight recorder. And then everything that's going to happen is being recorded, and we can check at it later. So, oops, if I go ahead and click open this thing, there's a bunch of things happening here. So remember when I said that this was a report that I intentionally made to render not as efficiently? That's what's happening right now, because this visual is an I even branded it the overly detailed matrix, because this is just the fact that I put too many details in there and it's going to take a very long time. But there are these things happening here inside of my Performance Analyzer Pane, and this is giving me a duration, and these durations, they're varying between let's say 5 seconds to 1.7 seconds to probably somewhere around the 25 seconds here in the bottom. But this doesn't mean that much to us. There's bound to be something that I can look at, for instance. So if I click open this max duration card, for instance, I can see what's happening. Okay, so I've got almost 2 seconds for the visual rendering time, which is good. So I've got 45 milliseconds for the visual display. So if I take a look at what the actual query is, so I close it, that's always beautiful. So it is just a card displaying a max duration, and it's a very long one. Probably some debug line in there. So what's happening in here is there's a few things. The visual is rendering fine, and the DAX is, okay, it's 300 milliseconds, so it could probably be improved, probably. But what's really worrying me right now is this other wait time, because what is this? And well, the only way to explain this is I I jokingly called it "don't bother" before, but it is, well, it is wait time for other processes, because it is a number that's not officially known, but Power BI can only handle 4 to 5 different threads rendering things at the same time. So every other thing that's on there has to wait. Every other thing, so meaning text boxes and lines and rectangles, visuals, whatever we need, it is 4 to 5 at the same time, and everything else has to wait until the next one is finished. It is parallelism at its best. So this other, well, the only way you can reduce it is, well, throw away some visuals, throw away some clutter in there. And I've seen some people that made some shiny reports with instead of using a background, they put in animated GIFs, and they put SVG files in there, and they made rectangles, and they ended up with about 80 different visuals on a single report. So by just removing that and, well, hinting them towards just make an overlay in PowerPoint or whatever and do the same thing, that query time, well, that visual rendering time dropped to about 2 seconds, coming from, I think it was more than 1.5 minutes to render that single page. So reducing the other wait time is just reducing the numbers of visual you have, period. It's as easy as that. Okay, so the other one, the next one, is the visual display. And I'll switch to another one because I know for a fact that this is a bit more heavily rendering. And the thing is that I don't know by heart the name of this thing. So what is beautiful about this is that you can also sort by whatever you want to do. You can sort by the DAX query in the visual display. So if I sort by the visual display and then put it descending, so I can see the longest visual rendering first, I can go in there and look at it as well. So the visual rendering is, I knew all along that it was the map, because the visual rendering is, there's not that much that you can do about it. The only thing that influences it is the amount of data points you're setting on there. Like, for instance, this is a map of New York and New Jersey, and there are about, I keep forgetting, I think a bit shy of 200 data points rendering, no, sorry, 2,000 data points rendering on this single map. So it is logical that if those 2,000 data points need to be rendered on a map, that this is going to take a longer time than it takes to render a single card visual. So be aware of the visuals you're using, but also be aware that if you're using custom visuals, they're not bad custom visuals. I'm not saying that at all, but custom visuals typically take a hit on performance because they are not allowed to use the same endpoints and the same libraries in the Power BI service for security reasons. So they typically will take a hit on performance. So using custom visuals is good because they offer you a lot of flexibility and fill up gaps that exist in the current version of Power BI. But if you're using too many of them on a single page, you'll probably see some reduction in the performance. So as a rule of thumb, I tend to keep the number of visuals to about 10 to 12 on a single report. Again, what is a visual? That is everything that's on there that needs to be rendered. Text boxes, lines, rectangles, images, all those things. So you don't have to follow this, but I typically stick to that magic number. And so far my reports, other than these, generally run well, unless I've written some horrible DAX, but that's another story. So that's two of the wait times killed off, which is great. So what about the last one? What about DAX? Well, I know for a fact that this one renders a long time, but this is typically, well, this is just because the fact that it is at the leaf level, that is at the most granular level that I have for a station and for a date per user type that they have. Well, just generate me everything that you have. So it's generating a lot of data points inside of a matrix. So it is a lot of things to process for that matrix. So yes, it will take a long time to render. You just have to be mindful about this. Is it a bad thing to do so? Well, no, because I know end users, they tend to want these kind of things to stick to that Excel, that warm Excel feeling from hell that they still want to have. So at some point you will have to succumb and give into something. But let's take one of the other visuals. Let's say average duration, and go look at the DAX query. So I can copy the query, and then I can look at the query. So I can paste this in my favorite editor tool of all times, which is Notepad++. But, well, it's not that useful because there's no syntax highlighting, there's no interesting things that I can do with it, there's no syntax checking, there's no formatting. So, that's not that good. So I'll close this off again. Instead, I use this tool, and if you've seen a session by the Italians, Marco Russo, Alberto Ferrari, you've probably seen this tool as well. So it is this tool called DAX Studio, and DAX Studio allows you to quickly go ahead and check at things to do some digging into performance as well. Well, here's this thing called here's this thing. We can paste our query in there and we can do this. So I had to kill off the automatic connect window because it was opening on the other screen. But if you start this up, you will get this screen. So I can connect to whatever I'm using here inside of my Power BI desktop file, and I can connect to it. And this is going to give me the model as well, and I can use every single thing of this to be able to do. But I can run this query and see what's happening. So I can run this query and it's rendering quite easily. It's rendering quite fast, and I can keep running this and it'll come back instantly. But I want to do some digging on this because that's what we need to do. And there are two options to do that digging. There are two options, but again, if you're not Italian and you're not a DAX maestro, one of them will probably be less than ideal for you. You can either use the query plan or the server timings. And the query plan, so if you have a SQL Server background, you're probably used to these nice visual rendered query plans with a lot of useful information in there that you can process, or even use these external community tools to help you process them. Well, forget all about that and just look at text when doing analysis services, tabular queries that are being rendered, DAX queries. That's what I was looking for. It is less than ideal to look at. So the other thing that I want to use typically is this thing called server timings. So as soon as I enable that, I can go ahead and look at things, because this is opening for me a new tab, and this is giving me information about what's happening. So the total rendering time, FE and SE, the CPUs it's been using, the queries, those kind of things. So if I go ahead and render the same thing, well, it's going to do this. It's going to render that query for me. And like, whoa, well, it's rendered in 2 milliseconds. And wait a minute. This thing was saying here that it was 378 milliseconds for DAX rendering. So what's happening here is this thing called cache. Remember when I said that, is that the engine is remembering himself the results that are in this query. So what I need to do is clear out the cache to make sure that everything's flooded and everything's away. And as soon as this cache is cleared, it is going extremely slow. Usually it's done in an instant. Okay. So if I clear out the cache and run the same query again, okay, so DAX query is not doing DAX Studio is not doing what I want. Excellent. Nonetheless, I'll keep explaining. Well, there are some things happening here, and there are a few things that we need to be aware of, because what is this thing called FE and SE? That's the main question that you need to be asking yourself. And I'm going to touch on this briefly because it is too much to explain to you in an hour. But if you want to know more in depth about this, go to sqlbi.com and look for the performance analyzer sessions, performance analysis sessions by Marco, because they are a great reference to start doing this. But this thing called FE is the formula engine, and SE is the storage engine. And the storage engine stores the data. And it is the Vertipack analyzer at work, and Vertipack is the name that the engine has, and it stores everything in a column store fashion, and it optimizes data for output and storage. So it really compresses it really well. And that means that the data is kept small and that it can return those basic things that we need, so minimums and maximums and sums, instantly. This thing called formula engine is responsible for doing more complex operations. So this gets chunks of data from the storage engine. It prepares those chunks of data. It drops it into memory in an unoptimized way so that the formula engine can do its magic and then do that complex DAX and then render it. So typically what we see is that the formula engine takes a longer time because it has to receive the data, working on an optimized set and do the complex operations. And the storage engine does those things really quick, but the storage engine can only do these basic operations. So it is always going to be a collaboration between those two. But as a rule of thumb, I try to keep the majority of the bulk of my work inside of the storage engine, because that means that my model is handling the task and that it does not need to do those overly complex things in DAX to render those things, because I am a big fan of fixing it in the model and not having to write 10, 15 lines of DAX, because DAX is not my strongest suit. I can write it, but I prefer to model things and fix it that way. But it is a personal way of preference. You do with what you want to do. So if you want to go ahead and dig deeper into this, there is a bunch of things that you can do with it. But the most important thing, the most interesting thing as well, is that, well, the working with this thing is a bit clunky, to be completely honest with you. So I can remember when I said that I can export these results. I can export it to a JSON file. I've already done it a few hours ago. So I'm going to just export it and save it as a JSON file. And then afterwards, if you can find the button here called Load Performance Data, you can load up that JSON file that you have. And this will give you an overview of everything that you have. And you can also use this to go digging into what you need to do. And it is, other than you don't get to see the other wait time, it is generally a really good thing to look at, because you can go ahead and look at the queries. But you need to cross-reference for which visual it is. So my advice about this is, as soon as you identify the query that you want to have, then go into this and then start digging. Because the cool thing is, for instance, if I want to do this one, I can just double click on it. And it'll give me every information that I need to have. So it allows me to go digging into what I need to do. And then I can run these things and I can go ahead and dig into this, which is a really interesting thing. But in general, just try to keep it simple. Try to take baby steps. Try to go not entirely for the big bang approach, but these small baby steps to help you get forward, because it is not the most easy thing to do. And you will likely end up being a bit disheartened as well if you don't get those results instantly. But that is DAX Studio. That's the first one. I'm not going to show all of them because, well, I want to wrap up in time as well. Because I didn't mention it, my 2-week vacation time is starting tonight, so I have other plans after as well. But the second tool is this thing called Vertipack Analyzer, and it's also a tool from the Italians. And yes, you can use it from inside DAX Studio, but at this point, I'm not doing it because the features are not fully migrated there yet. I'm still a stickler for the old school version in Excel. So what do I mean with this is, if I open up the right folder, so it is an Excel file. And there's a bunch of Excel files in here. And if I open up the one that is accompanied for the report, then Excel is opening on the different screen, obviously. So Excel opens up, and this gives me a bunch of information. But this gives me the information about the model internals. And that's where I typically do the grunt of my work, because optimizing the model will lend itself to having those more easy results later on. So I can get in here and look at a bunch of different things. I can look at what the tables are and how large their data is and what kind of columns I have and data types. But also, this is where it gets cool, is I can go ahead and look at what calculated columns there are or what calculated tables there are and those things. So you immediately get an inventory of what DAX measures are being used. So the same thing is with your measures. They're all in there. You can just easily get them out, which is quite cool, because otherwise you probably have to look for a very long time to find these things. So all these things from compression and encoding, that's those raw internals that I spoke about that are not inside of DAX Studio yet. But the main thing is, well, we generally start looking here inside of the Vertipack Analyzer for our model. And what we want to be looking at is, well, typically, how large is the field you're having compared to the database and compared to the table that we're using. So for instance, I've got this table right here called bikes, and there's this one field that's taking up 99.9%, which is it's the only field in there, so that's quite logical. But the database size is about 0.6%, 0.06%, which is not that bad. So the majority of my size in here is actually inside of my trips table. And that is my table holding all the measures, holding all the interesting details. So that's actually quite good, because all the other things that are in here, I've optimized them in this thing called a star schema. And I'll get back to that briefly after as well. But that star schema puts the majority of the weight and load inside of my fact table. And because the majority of those fields used, they're all just keys that are being used to render, keys being used to build out foreign keys, or they are actual values to be used for measures. But that is a modeling technique that we can go on for hours and hours and hours, and that's not the general idea of this one. So typically, when I look in here, it is finding those fields that are high size, that have a large cardinality as well. Because for instance, here is that this table has 21 million rows in it. And the largest field that is in there is this thing called trip duration in seconds, which has about 34,500 unique values. So that means that there's no high cardinality value in here. There's no highly unique values in here. And that helps this thing called the Vertipack Analyzer to do its job, because it compresses all the different distinct values in there, and it compresses them up as good as it can do. So that is really interesting to keep in mind, because if, for instance, I close off this one and I go back to one of the earlier versions, let's say the second one, which is just the raw data imported in there with the same thing. So it is apparently a few more, well, it has less records in there, which is not the point right now. But it is this thing called the same table that I have. And then we have this thing called start time and stop time, and it has close to 16 million unique values. So date time values, they're typically culprits of bloating up a model. And especially if there's being this feature called auto date time used, then they typically really blow up this thing. So there are a lot of things happening in here. And if I look again to these things in the database size, the majority of the weight is still in here, which is okay. But these two fields, the date and the time fields, they take up about 95% of my entire model, which just isn't right. It's too much for two fields to be taking in for themselves. And also, if I go up again to the calculated columns, I'm seeing a bunch of these things here, and those are all automatically generated date-time tables, which will lead to degraded performance as well. But I will get to that too. So I close them off again, and for a reference, I should have emphasized that more clearly before as well, is I took a step approach to this thing. The step approach is, well, I went from loading the base file which was about, 950 megabyte, reducing a few single steps to reducing a bunch more of things. So I went from the 960 megabytes to a model size of 160 megabytes. And those measures running in there, they run a lot quicker inside of the more tweaked model as well, because they have to look through less data. They can get to their results a lot quicker, which is, for me, as I mentioned, modeling first is the most important metric for me. As the model decreases in size, and if it's still able to handle the requests that we have, the storage engine, which is the fastest one, can do its work, and it'll end up being a better thing for that as well. So I can keep going on about this for a very long time. And I also haven't shown you how to refresh the data in there, but as I mentioned, go to sqlbi.com and they've got it explained on their blog, on their website, which it's not that difficult. It is, if you're used to working with Power Pivot inside of Excel, you'll get this in no time as well. Because there is a third tool that I want to show you, and I'll only show this to you very briefly. It is this tool called Tabular Editor. And Tabular Editor pretty much boils down to a lightweight editor for analysis services, which is still true up until this point. But there are some very big things brewing for Tabular Editor in combination with Power BI. So in the near future, in the very near future, we'll be able to use this tool called Tabular Editor and use this to build out models for Power BI as well. And it's based on this thing called the enhanced metadata feature that's rolling out right now, and they're improving it because there's some bugs with it that made people lose about 10 days of work and those things, but it is coming. But for now, I only use this thing for one specific reason, to check what my colleagues have been doing, to check if they are adhering to my best practices. Because in general, if someone hands me a model and says, hey, Benny, can you look at this report and just give us some quick tips? Well, what I do is step one is open Vertipack Analyzer and look at the model. And then step two is open up Tabular Editor and run this thing called the Best Practice Analyzer to see what they're doing in there. So Vertipack Analyzer we've shown that just now, but this thing called Best Practice Analyzer is actually pretty cool. It runs inside of Tabular Editor, and it's based, so the window is opening up on the wrong screen again. It is based on best practices. So I need to load them up first, and I've cheated. I've made sure that I've got a rule file and all those things, but you can go ahead and get this from the website of the creator called Daniel Otekia. You can just get it. So I can go ahead and include a local rule file, and it should be, it is just a JSON file, and we can edit that JSON file as well to add our own rules in there. So I can add it in here. So now I've got this thing called best practices. And then with the click of a button, I can get a full overview of what's happening inside that model and what's not adhering to the best practices that I've agreed on with my team, which is pretty cool because this took me about 5 seconds to get a complete list of some things that they need to be changing, rather than, well, okay, let's open up Power BI, let's go to the modeling view, let's check out their measures, what they've been doing. It can be so much quicker. And if I don't have to spend time digging through the Power BI desktop files to check what they're doing, well, it'll make my life easier and I can get more work done or have a longer lunch break, which is also good. So for now, this is the only thing that I'm using Tabular Editor for, because at this point, this will still very likely break your Power BI desktop file. So until the moment where we've been giving the official go, please only use Tabular Editor to check the best practices or to make changes that you're absolutely 100% certain that it will not break after you've taken about 25 backups. Because, well, you don't want to lose work, period. So back to the slides. There are a bunch of other tools in here, and I still need to update this list because there are a bunch of new tools out there as well. But this is my tool set depending on where I'm at a customer. What I can do with installing executable files and those things is typically my tool set that I use to start digging inside of reports to check what's happening, what's going on. If there's a budget involved and you have the budget for it, I would encourage you to take a look at Power BI Sentinel. It's this company owned by Birmingham MVP called Alex Whittles, and it is impressive what they can do at a budget. So if you have that budget and your company is willing to splash for it, take a look at it because it can do some pretty cool things to save you a lot of time. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of tips and best practices that I want to share with you as well. And I cannot go through all of them because that would take me another hour or so, but they are all listed inside of the PowerPoint thingy. And I will share the slides with you anyway. So you will get this. And if, as I mentioned, if you have a question, reach out to me on the socials and I'll do my best to help you after 2 weeks because I'm planning on going away for the next 2 weeks. So my golden rules for working with the data inside of Power BI is, well, transform your data as early as possible. What do I mean by this is, for instance, if you need to extract a certain number of characters from a string, then do it as early on in the process as you can. If you have a SQL if you have a SQL source, well, it makes sense to do it in a view or in the query. It makes sense to do it in Power Query at the very latest, so that the data that we're sending to Power BI gets optimized in the model. As a rule of thumb, I typically do not use calculated columns. Why? Calculated columns, they are not fully optimized inside of the engine. The data is stored in there, but this thing leveraging for the find and seek functionality called the dictionary is not optimized. So it will typically give you a slower performance as well. But also be aware that if you're dumping a load back into Power Query or into views, that will take a longer time. Your refreshes will take a longer time. But a single refresh in the night or during lunch, or waiting 5 seconds longer for every time the visual needs to be rendered, is a trade-off that I'm willing to make. But do those transformations as early on as you can, but do them once, just the one time. Because if you're extracting those values, let's say in the SQL view, and then you're pasting them back together in Power Query, and then you're doing a DAX calculated column again in the last thing, well, we're probably wasting resources and time. So do it just the one time, because every time you do a similar transformation, the data needs to be picked up, resources need to be spent, and we can keep on going. But also, well, do them smart. Just use some common sense. Try to think about what you're doing. Try to make sure that, is what I'm doing, does it make sense? Is it logical for the report that I need to be using? And will it make their life a lot more easy? That's my golden rules for transforming the data when working with Power BI. There's probably some more that we can add, but these are the ones that I really try to stick to and try to enforce in my colleagues. So one of the steps that I took inside of Power Query was optimizing the data types. So if I quickly go back to my Explorer view, well, it meant that I had a single drop from those 960 megabytes to about 790 megabytes. And that's just the basic step that Power BI is doing. It'll go auto detect whatever we need to do. Later on, I reduced it even more, just by making sure that integer values are integers and dates are split into date and times and those things. It can really mean a big difference in what you're doing in the model. Auto date time is the bane of my existence. It is a useful feature when we're working with a simple proof of concept, or we're quickly trying to prototype something. But this feature will automatically generate a date time table for every date time field that we have in the model. And it will generate that for the min and the max value that it detected. So quick story about this, very quick one, is I had a customer and they had a semi-data warehouse where they had minimum dates set at January 1st, 1900. And if the date was unknown, and if the date was to be determined, they set it to January 1st, 2100. So that meant that the min and the max was 1900 to 2100. And they had about 270 date time fields in the data that they were loading in there. So 270 tables were generated for 200 years. So that model didn't fit into Power BI Pro, into shared capacity, and that model didn't fit into premium capacity as well, with the 13 gigabyte limit. So they wanted to get me to fix it into the large dataset preview, but then I explained them how this thing worked, and it dropped about 95% of the data. So be mindful of this thing when you're using it. So columns and rows, same thing. If you're not using it inside of the report or calculations, well, throw it out there. Just toss it out, because it'll take up space that we can use otherwise. When we're going into modeling, and I'll pick up the pace a bit, is, well, for me, star schemas work best. Power BI is optimized to work with star schemas. Dimensional models, denormalized models, whatever you want to call them, star schemas work well. So if I go back to this one, remember when it went from 960-ish megabytes to about 160 megabytes? Well, that is just the big drop that we're seeing with a star schema. It is optimized for working that way. Is it intuitive to everyone using Power BI? No, but trust me when I say, if you get yourself familiarized with this way of working, you will have, well, it'll generally improve some things that you're doing inside of Power BI. So when we're building out those relationships between the tables, well, persistent surrogate keys, they're typically better. What I mean with this is that this is an integer value that is just generated, or if we have primary keys from databases, that's also well as well. But those integers work best in compression, and they need to be persistent. So they cannot be calculated columns, because they are not optimized. And if we use them, the storage will go down, and the engine can do its work quicker to start working their way to those relationships. Bidirectional filtering is not ideal for most situations, because it can lead to very, 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 very awkward situations when you're getting results you cannot explain. And then if you do have to do bidirectional filtering, you may want to look at the cross filter function in DAX rather than just setting the entire thing to bidirectional filtering. It takes a bit more work, but it will lead to better performance and to a better usability of your model. Auto date time should be disabled. Rather, we just make a single date dimension and then mark it as a date table. Role-playing dimensions, meaning that if I have an order date, a ship date, a production date, a sales date, whatever dates we still have, well, you can also just make a new physical dimension for it. Is it better? Is it best? Well, debate it. I've had endless discussion with peers about this, and purely performance-wise, there is a marginal gain if you have a physical dimension up until about 4 to 5 different role-playing dimensions. After that, it's just blowing up the model again, and it makes less sense. So debate them. Whatever the best practices in your team should work. Data types should be optimized as much as you can to make sure that you can leverage that thing the most as you can. Wide tables are, well, they tend to be large in size. And if it's large in size, that means that the engine will have a harder time working its way through it to retrieve data. So removing those unused rows and columns, just keeping it lean and mean, small, simple, it'll end up having you with a better model and a better model with better performance and happier users in general. So when you're working inside of the model as well if you're doing side steps in Power Query, you only want to use those queries that are effectively being used in the model. So if it's staging queries, they don't have a place inside of the model. So mark them, disable them for load, and then they will stay inside of Power Query and they will not be loaded to the model. So inappropriate summarization is this feature that is enabled by default in Power BI, meaning that if we have an integer value, Power BI will think, oh, cool, well, I can sum this. So the second you drag it up until the canvas, it'll give you a sum. Implicit measures, these are called as well, or naked measures I've heard as well. They do not work inside of Excel. So if you're using the Analyze in Excel feature and you're just using these things, just these basic measures that are auto-generated on the fly, Excel will not recognize them and you cannot use it. So rather just make a simple sum measure, because it will also lead up to the fact that the engine can optimize for it and it'll give you a small marginal gain for it and still work in Excel, by the way. So data granularity is something that you need to think of as well. Do you really need that transactional level at the bare transaction, or can you work with hourly aggregates? Can you work with daily aggregates? Those kind of things. Those are things to think about as well. Do you actually need all those things? And then not for performance, but just keeping it clean, is all those key fields you use to render, to build out relationships, hide them from the view, because your end users don't have anything to do with this as well. They don't need that information. So you can just hide it to make sure that they cannot use it. And then as well, before I go into the wrap up, is consider the source that you have and the refresh schedule you're using. What kind of source do you have? Is it a beefy SQL? Is it a collection of Excel files located in OneDrive? Is it an API? And what can they take for refresh schedules as well? Because if you want to have that data updated every single hour and the source system cannot handle it, well, you'll end up having some bad performance issues there as well. So think about those things when working with it. So I'm going to skip the sections about Power Query and DAX because I'm badly running out of time, and I'm going to go into the wrap up. So as I said, everything that I'm referring to here, it's all in there. It's all in the slide deck, and you can read through it. And if you have some questions, just reach out to me after as well. There is one thing that I want to show you. Does it automatically switch? Nope, it doesn't. So yeah, I had a bunch more content, as you can see. There is this one tweet that I want to show you, and it is this tweet from a Power BI CAT member. So it is a program member called Chris Hamill. He's not the one shouting out yo on the YouTube or whatever, and he's not Chris Webb, as you know, from the UK as well. He's less front-end based, let's say it, but typically when he releases something, you'll know that it's spot on. And back in August 2019, so it's getting close to a year already. He released this tweet where he just did a comparison between two browsers, because at the time there was still a very big difference in them. So he was rendering a single report, which is visually intensive, inside of different browsers and then time boxing it. How long does it take to render? So the GIF that we're seeing here is that the Chromium-based browser, well, it speeds up the loading time. It's done at about 8, 9, 10-ish seconds. And the Edge browser, it was taking about 30 seconds. So we jokingly asked what Internet Explorer was doing, and it's probably still rendering in the year 2020 as well. But the choice of browser you have has a very big impact on this visual rendering as well. So by now, Edge also has Chromium built into it by default, and it'll make visual rendering, it'll make it a lot easier. But I'm also mindful that you've probably got compliancy to think about at your company and those things. But it is something to think about. Just when a user makes a report and he says, well, my report's not rendering fast. And if he's using Internet Explorer, then you can probably assume that there's some version of HTML that they're working on and a backwards compatibility that's not working properly. And it is always something to keep in mind, because when I mentioned it works on my machine, this is the same thing, because the browser that the end user is using will have an impact, but also the resources that he has. Does he have a big beefy GPU card, or is it a laptop, desktop? It has an impact. So that's what I want to give to you as well, is just think about those situations that an end user has as well, because they will have a big impact on what we're seeing. So as a takeaway, well, I do want to mention at least one more time as well, is that keep these performance things in mind when you're designing a model, when you're designing a report, when you're designing these measures, because all the time that you save off afterwards to having to fix these things, probably under stress because there's some angry caller calling you to fix it right away, well, you'll have a better experience for it. And making sure that you keep those transformations under control and dumping as much of a load to the Power Query or SQL or whatever source system you have, that will help you get the better performance inside of your report. For me, modeling is key, meaning that my star schema approach lends me to have the storage engine doing the grunt of the work and having those better performances. DAX measures will still need to be used, and I still have to write complex DAX, but I don't have to go grab things from other tables inside of a query and then do some other calculations with it. It is all just taken care of. So yes, my refresh time is longer, but that doesn't matter because it's happening overnight anyway most of the time. The choice of the browser and the hardware matters as well, as we've just experienced inside of a tweet. And then, well, just create for yourself like a personal set of tools and best practices that you want to use. Tabular editor, for instance, DAX Studio, whatever tool you want to use, make that tool your own and start thinking about what you want to do with it, how you want to use it, because just go step by step and work your way with it. Because the main thing is that you want to keep learning, and the only way you'll learn is by doing things, and the only way you'll know what to do is by reading up on things. So just read resources online. There's plenty of blogs, there's plenty of vlogs these days as well, because everyone's releasing a podcast by now. Just pick a few things that you want to master yourself and focus on that. Just work your way through them and go along with them, because I didn't know the things that I know now 3-4 years ago. I learned them by doing, and I learned them by smashing my head into the wall multiple times. Period. You learn, you make mistakes, you learn from those mistakes, you move on. And that's the way it works. So there is a bunch of resources in here that you can use and you can go ahead and look at. Please do look at them. They are highly interesting. Again, my socials, they're on here as well. So if you want to get a hold of me through the socials, you can use them here. You can grab them again. And that is pretty much it. So if there are any questions, I'll gladly take them right now.
Hey, Benny, there's it's Ben here. There's none. Brilliant session, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There aren't any pressing questions in the Q&A at the moment, so you can get back off your holiday. I just wanted to say a couple of things. I love the hashtag. I'm going to let Alex wrap up shortly, but I love the hashtag say no to pie charts, and let's just add donut charts on there and a load of other stuff as well.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you can happy to print your PowerPoints off to a PDF, and if people contact you, they can just get them that way. So that was it from me. A couple of things I took out of that, which I always take out of these things anyway. Auto date and time, just turn it off. Saw that earlier this week as well, because it will save you sizing the model. And then, go and download DAX Studio and Tabular Editor. We saw that at the Manchester Power BI group, I think last year as well. So, it's good that this stuff is gaining traction. So
you'll see very big improvements with Tabular Editor in a few months probably. It'll become very, very big for Power BI.
Yeah. No, well, let's hope these things remain free, because they're fabulous tools as well. Well, I'm going to pass over to Alex to wrap up. Alex, I won't bother putting your video on the screen, I don't think, unless you really want it.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Just want to say thank you very much to Benny for this evening's talk. Appreciate you coming back after we had some technical issues last time, and appreciate you doing it before you go on holiday. It was a really good talk, and we'll be pushing it out so more people can watch it on demand, because it's I think it's very, very valuable hours worth of session you've given tonight. So thank you very much for speaking. It's a shame you couldn't come across to sunny Manchester.
Yeah, would have loved being there.
Yeah, we'll make sure the time in the very near future for you to come across. There's always lots of events in the Northwest, so we'd love to have you across to present at the youth group when we can have face-to-face sessions back in play, hopefully next year. So thank you very much for your session tonight. Just to recap, we've got Adriano De Silva presenting at Power BI Lunch and Learn this Wednesday, so that's 12:30 UK time. So do send through your I'll send through the Teams link, so you can join the session. That'll be with Adriano Silva, Ben, Sheb, Lewis, and myself. And then in 3 weeks' time, the user group for July is back. That's the Wednesday the 29th of July. We've got Alan Skuger, Victor Rodriguez, and Dennis Torres. We've got 3 talks. So that's a 2-hour, 20-minute session on the 29th of July. So look out for that, and do RSVP on the meetup. So thank you very much for everyone who's logged in tonight to watch tonight's session. Enjoy your evening, and I will catch you very, very soon. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Cheers, Benny.